The morning sun cast long shadows across the naval base as Elena Rodriguez adjusted her press credentials one more time. As a military correspondent for Defense Weekly, she had covered dozens of training exercises, but today felt different. The Navy SEALs were conducting their annual combat readiness demonstration, and she was here strictly as an observer, notebook in hand and camera around her neck. Elena had grown up in a military family. Her father served 3 tours in Afghanistan. Her brother was currently deployed with the Marines, and she understood the weight of the uniform better than most civilians. But she had never been this close to the elite SEAL teams before. Their reputation preceded them, the best of the best, men who operated in shadows and silence, whose very presence commanded respect. Commander Jake Sullivan stood at the edge of the training area, his weathered hands clasped behind his back as he watched his team prepare for the demonstration. At 38, he had spent nearly 2 decades in the Navy, with the last 12 as a SEAL. His face bore the subtle scars of countless missions, and his eyes held the steady, calculating gaze of someone who had seen too much but never wavered in his duty. The demonstration area buzzed with controlled energy. Visiting officials, military brass, and selected members of the press gathered in the designated viewing area, while the SEAL team ran through their final equipment checks. Elena positioned herself at the far end of the observer section, close enough to capture good photos but far enough away to avoid interfering with the proceedings. Commander Sullivan addressed the gathered audience with the crisp professionalism expected of his rank. His voice carried easily across the space as he outlined what they would witness: a simulated hostage rescue operation that would showcase the precision, teamwork, and tactical excellence that defined SEAL operations. Elena found herself studying the commander as he spoke. There was something magnetic about his presence, the way he commanded attention without raising his voice or making grand gestures. She had interviewed dozens of military leaders over the years, but Sullivan possessed a quiet intensity that set him apart. His team clearly respected him. She could see it in the way they positioned themselves, how they responded to his subtle hand signals, the confidence in their movements as they prepared for the exercise. The scenario was complex by design. A mock terrorist cell had taken hostages in a multi-story building constructed specifically for training purposes. The SEALs would have to navigate multiple entry points, neutralize threats, and extract civilians without casualties. Elena knew enough about military tactics to understand that what looked like controlled chaos to untrained eyes was actually a carefully choreographed display of years of training and battlefield experience. As the exercise began, Elena raised her camera and started documenting the operation. Through her lens, she watched the SEALs move with fluid precision. Their communication was minimal but effective. Hand signals, subtle movements, the kind of wordless coordination that only came from countless hours of working together under pressure. Commander Sullivan remained in the command position, monitoring radio chatter and maintaining overwatch of the entire operation. Elena noticed how his attention never wavered, how he seemed to anticipate his team's needs before they voiced them. This was leadership forged in real combat, refined through experience that most people could never imagine. The first phase of the operation unfolded flawlessly. The team breached the building from multiple points simultaneously, their movements so synchronized it appeared almost choreographed. Elena captured frame after frame, documenting the professional excellence on display. She found herself genuinely impressed by what she was witnessing. This was military training at its absolute peak. Halfway through the exercise, one of the mock hostages, a female sailor playing the role of a civilian, stumbled during the evacuation simulation. Elena lowered her camera instinctively, her journalist training taking over as she assessed whether this was part of the scenario or an actual problem. The SEAL team maintained their positions, suggesting it was an unscripted moment that they were adapting to in real time. Commander Sullivan's voice came through the radio with calm authority, adjusting the team's approach to account for the injured hostage scenario. Elena watched him process multiple variables simultaneously: the safety of his team, the success of the mission, the well-being of all participants. It was a masterclass in leadership under pressure, even in a training environment. The temperature was rising as the morning progressed, and Elena felt perspiration beginning to form under her lightweight jacket. Without thinking, she unzipped it and pushed up her sleeves, focusing her attention back on the ongoing operation. The SEALs were now in the final phase of the exercise, systematically clearing the remaining floors of the training building while maintaining security for the extracted hostages. Elena positioned herself for a better angle to photograph the team's exit strategy. She wanted to capture the moment when they emerged with the rescued hostages, the culmination of their tactical excellence. As she raised her camera again, she noticed Commander Sullivan had shifted his position slightly, moving closer to the viewing area while maintaining his oversight role. The exercise reached its climax as the SEAL team completed their final sweep and began their organized withdrawal from the training building. Elena snapped photos of their professional formation, their weapons discipline, the way they maintained security even during what was essentially a training demonstration. These men took nothing for granted, treated every scenario as if lives truly hung in the balance. Commander Sullivan's team executed a textbook extraction, moving the mock hostages to the designated safe zone while maintaining perimeter security. Elena captured the moment when Sullivan gave the all-clear signal, officially ending the exercise. The tension that had built throughout the morning seemed to release all at once as team members began their post-exercise procedures. As Elena reviewed the photos on her camera's display, she felt satisfied with her documentation of the event. The images told the story of American military excellence, of the dedication and skill that protected the nation's interests around the world. She had what she needed for her article, and, more importantly, she had witnessed something genuinely impressive. The debriefing process began immediately, with team members gathering around Commander Sullivan for their after-action review. Elena knew this was standard procedure. Even training exercises were analyzed for lessons learned and areas for improvement. It was this attention to detail, this commitment to constant improvement, that kept these warriors at the top of their game. Elena began packing her equipment, preparing to leave the base, and returned to her office to write up her coverage of the demonstration. She had conducted brief interviews with several team members earlier in the day, gathering quotes and background information that would round out her article. The story practically wrote itself, a straightforward piece about SEAL training excellence and readiness. As she secured her camera in its case, Elena felt the warmth of the sun on her exposed arms. The morning had been more engaging than she expected, and she found herself genuinely appreciating the professionalism she had witnessed. These weren't just soldiers going through the motions of a demonstration. They were craftsmen perfecting their art, even in a controlled environment. Commander Sullivan approached the viewing area as the crowd began to disperse. Elena assumed he was making his courtesy rounds, thanking the observers for their attendance and answering any final questions. She continued organizing her notes, half listening to the conversations around her as base personnel began the process of clearing the demonstration area. The sound of approaching footsteps made Elena look up from her equipment bag. Commander Sullivan was walking directly toward her, his expression unreadable but focused. She straightened up, assuming he wanted to speak with her about her coverage or perhaps needed clarification about what could be included in her published article. Military public affairs protocols were always strict about operational security, even for training demonstrations. What Elena didn't realize was that something had caught Sullivan's attention during the final phase of the exercise. As she had repositioned herself for better photos, pushing up her sleeves against the morning heat, a tattoo on her left forearm had become visible. It wasn't large or particularly elaborate, but it was specific enough to trigger recognition in someone who had spent years in classified operations around the world. The tattoo depicted a small compass rose with coordinates beneath it. To most observers, it would appear to be a simple navigational design, perhaps chosen by someone who loved travel or sailing. But Commander Sullivan recognized those specific coordinates, and their significance sent a chill through him despite the warming day. Those numbers represented a location that officially didn't exist, a place where he had spent 3 weeks of his life on a mission that had never been acknowledged by any government agency. As Sullivan drew closer, Elena noticed the change in his demeanor. The professional courtesy she expected was replaced by something more intense, more personal. His eyes were fixed on her forearm, and she instinctively glanced down to see what had captured his attention. The tattoo was clearly visible, and she realized that this decorated SEAL commander was staring at it with an expression she couldn't quite interpret. The background noise of the departing crowd seemed to fade as Sullivan stopped directly in front of her. Elena had interviewed enough military personnel to recognize when someone was operating on a different level of intensity. This wasn't about her press coverage or standard post-demonstration protocols. Something about her tattoo had triggered a response in this experienced operator, and the morning was about to take an unexpected turn. Commander Sullivan stood motionless for what felt like an eternity, his trained eyes fixed on the coordinates tattooed beneath the compass rose on Elena's forearm. The numbers burned into his memory with perfect clarity. 34 degrees, 52 minutes north, 69 degrees, 10 minutes east. Those coordinates represented a mountainous region in Afghanistan where no American forces were supposed to have operated, where no mission had ever officially taken place, yet where he had spent 21 days that changed the trajectory of his entire career. Elena noticed the complete transformation in Sullivan's demeanor. The professional commander who had just completed a flawless training demonstration was now staring at her with an intensity that bordered on recognition. She glanced around the dispersing crowd, suddenly, aware that their interaction had taken on a weight that seemed disproportionate to a routine media event. "Where did you get that tattoo?" Sullivan's voice was barely above a whisper, but the command presence behind it made Elena instinctively straighten. The question caught her off guard. In all her years covering military affairs, no service member had ever shown such intense interest in her personal tattoo. She had expected questions about her article deadline, her publication schedule, perhaps clarification about attribution protocols. Instead, this decorated seal was asking about something deeply personal with an urgency that suggested it was anything but casual curiosity. "It's from my father," Elena replied carefully, watching Sullivan's face for any indication of what had triggered this unexpected line of inquiry. "He served in Afghanistan. Those coordinates marked a place that was important to him, though he never told me exactly why." The color drained from Sullivan's face as Elena spoke. Her father. Afghanistan. The pieces of a puzzle he had carried for over a decade began shifting into place, forming a picture that shouldn't have been possible, yet was standing right in front of him. He knew those coordinates because he had been there, had spent 3 weeks in that exact location on a mission that officially never happened. "What was your father's name?" Sullivan asked, his voice now carrying the controlled tension of someone trying to process information that challenged everything he thought he understood about classified operations and family connections. Elena hesitated, sensing that her answer would somehow be significant beyond anything she could currently comprehend. "Master Sergeant Carlos Rodriguez, Army Special Forces. He died in a training accident 6 months after returning from his final deployment." Sullivan's world tilted slightly on its axis. Carlos Rodriguez. He remembered the name now, remembered the quiet Special Forces soldier who had been temporarily attached to his SEAL team for that impossible mission in the Afghan mountains. Rodriguez had been the team's liaison with local intelligence assets, the man who spoke fluent Pashto and understood the cultural nuances that meant the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. The mission had been classified at levels that most military personnel never encountered. A high-value target with connections to both terrorist networks and legitimate government officials needed to be eliminated without any official American involvement. The operation required a team small enough to avoid detection but skilled enough to navigate the complex political and military landscape of that particular region. Rodriguez had been essential to the mission's success, but he had also been witness to something that the powers organizing the operation had never intended for him to see. During the final phase of their target elimination, they had discovered documents that revealed connections between their target and certain American officials, connections that would have created an international incident if they had ever become public knowledge. Sullivan remembered the long conversations he and Rodriguez had shared during the cold mountain nights, waiting for their opportunity to complete the mission. Rodriguez had spoken about his daughter, how proud he was of her work as a journalist, how he hoped she would continue asking hard questions and seeking truth even when it was dangerous to do so. "Your father saved my life," Sullivan said quietly, the words carrying weight that Elena couldn't yet fully understand. "And the lives of 5 other American servicemen. But that's not the most important thing he did on that mission." Elena's journalistic instincts kicked into high gear, even as her personal emotions began churning with the realization that this man had known her father in ways she never imagined. Her father had rarely spoken about his deployments in specific terms, always deflecting her questions about his experiences with gentle humor and subject changes. "He never told me about working with Navy SEALs," Elena said, studying Sullivan's face for any indication of deception. "He was always very careful about operational security, never shared details about specific missions or units he worked with." Sullivan nodded, recognizing the professional discretion that had characterized Rodriguez throughout their time together. It was one of the qualities that had made him such an effective operator, his ability to compartmentalize information and protect operational security even within his own family. But it was also the quality that had ultimately led to his death. The training accident that had killed Carlos Rodriguez hadn't been an accident at all. Sullivan knew this because he had spent 2 years quietly investigating the circumstances surrounding Rodriguez's death, using his security clearance and professional connections to piece together a truth that had been carefully hidden from official records. 3 weeks after their return from the Afghanistan mission, Rodriguez had contacted Sullivan through secure channels. He had been asking questions about the documents they had discovered, expressing concerns about the implications of what they had learned. Rodriguez was a patriot, but he was also a man who believed in accountability, even when accountability was inconvenient for powerful people. "Your father discovered something during our mission together," Sullivan continued, keeping his voice low even though the demonstration area was now largely empty. Information that certain people didn't want him to possess. He was asking the right questions, pursuing leads that made some very dangerous people uncomfortable. Elena felt a chill run through her despite the warm afternoon sun. She had always suspected there was more to her father's death than the official reports indicated. The training accident had supposedly occurred during a routine parachute exercise, but several details had never made complete sense to her. Her father was an experienced jumper with thousands of successful drops, and the equipment failure that allegedly caused his death had been unusual enough to warrant investigation. But the investigation had been brief and conclusive, attributing the accident to a combination of equipment malfunction and unusual wind conditions. Elena had been told that sometimes even the most experienced operators encountered situations that were simply beyond their control. She had accepted this explanation because she had no choice, because challenging it would have meant questioning the integrity of the entire military system that her family had served faithfully for generations. "What kind of information?" Elena asked, her reporter's training taking over even as her personal emotions threatened to overwhelm her professional objectivity. Sullivan glanced around the now quiet demonstration area, confirming that their conversation was private before continuing. "Evidence of financial connections between our target and certain American officials. Money that had been moved through offshore accounts, weapons deals that bypassed official channels, intelligence that had been shared with enemy forces in exchange for personal gain." The implications hit Elena like a physical blow. Her father hadn't just been a soldier completing a dangerous mission. He had been witness to evidence of treason at the highest levels of government. And his death hadn't been a tragic accident. It had been murder designed to silence someone who possessed information that could have brought down careers and ended the freedom of powerful individuals. "Do you have proof of this?" Elena asked, her journalistic instincts demanding verification even as her heart raced with the possibility that her father's death might finally make sense. Sullivan reached into his pocket and withdrew a small device that looked like a standard military thumb drive. "Your father gave this to me 3 days before he died. He said that if anything happened to him, I should find a way to get this information to someone who would know what to do with it. Someone who understood the importance of truth and wasn't afraid to ask difficult questions." Elena stared at the device, understanding that she was being offered answers to questions that had haunted her for years. But she also understood that accepting this information would put her in the same position that had ultimately cost her father his life. Powerful people had already killed once to protect the secrets contained on that device, and they wouldn't hesitate to do so again. "Why didn't you come forward with this before now?" Elena asked, testing Sullivan's credibility and trying to understand why he had waited so long to honor her father's final request. "Because I've been trying to build a case that would stick," Sullivan replied honestly. "The people involved in this have connections throughout the military and intelligence communities. Simply releasing raw information wouldn't have been enough. It would have been dismissed as fabricated evidence or dismissed as the ravings of disgruntled soldiers. I needed context, corroboration, additional evidence that would make the truth undeniable. Elena realized that Sullivan had been conducting his own investigation for years, using his position and security clearance to slowly gather the additional evidence needed to support her father's discoveries. It explained his presence at this particular demonstration, his careful observation of the assembled media representatives. He had been looking for the right opportunity, the right person to trust with information that could reshape public understanding of recent military operations. What changed? Elena asked. Why now? Why me? Sullivan gestured toward her tattoo, the compass rose and coordinates that had started this entire conversation. Because your father told me about that tattoo. He said you had gotten it to honor his service, using coordinates from a place that was important to him. I never thought I would actually encounter you in person, but when I saw those specific numbers, I knew it wasn't coincidence. Elena looked down at her tattoo with new understanding. Her father had given her those coordinates shortly before his death, telling her they represented a place where he had done something that mattered, something that had made a difference. She had assumed he was referring to some humanitarian mission or successful operation that had saved civilian lives. She never imagined that those numbers would someday connect her to the truth about how and why he had died. The weight of decision settled on Elena's shoulders as she realized that accepting Sullivan's information would change everything about her life and career. She would no longer be a military correspondent covering routine demonstrations and policy announcements. She would become an investigative journalist in possession of evidence that powerful people had killed to protect, evidence that could expose corruption at the highest levels of government, while simultaneously making her a target for elimination. But she was also her father's daughter, raised to believe in truth and justice even when they came at personal cost. Carlos Rodriguez had died because he refused to remain silent about evidence of betrayal and corruption. Now his daughter was being offered the opportunity to complete the mission he had started, to ensure that his death would ultimately serve a purpose greater than protecting the careers of corrupt officials. If I take this, Elena said quietly, my life changes completely. I become a target, just like my father was. Sullivan nodded solemnly. Yes, but you also become the person who can finally give your father's death meaning. The people who killed him are still in positions of power, still making decisions that affect American servicemen and women around the world. The information on this drive could bring them to justice. Elena thought about her father's values, the lessons he had taught her about standing up for what was right even when it was dangerous or difficult. She thought about the other families who had lost loved ones because of the corruption her father had discovered, the soldiers who had been put at risk by officials more concerned with personal profit than national security. The decision, when it came, felt inevitable. Elena extended her hand towards Sullivan, accepting the thumb drive and everything it represented. As her fingers closed around the small device, she understood that she was crossing a line from which there would be no return. But she was also honoring her father's memory in the most meaningful way possible. What do I do now? Elena asked, feeling the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. Sullivan's expression shifted from uncertainty to determination as he realized that Elena was committed to pursuing the truth regardless of personal cost. Now you become very careful about who you trust, and you start building a case that will bring justice for your father and accountability for the people who killed him. 3 weeks had passed since Elena's encounter with Commander Sullivan at the naval base, and her life had transformed into something she barely recognized. The thumb drive containing her father's final evidence sat in a safety deposit box across town, while Elena methodically worked through the process of verification and investigation that Sullivan had outlined for her. The initial contents of the drive had been overwhelming. Financial records showing money transfers between offshore accounts, encrypted communications between high-ranking military officials and known arms dealers, photographic evidence of meetings that should never have taken place. Her father had been incredibly thorough in documenting what he had discovered, creating a paper trail that connected dozens of individuals across multiple government agencies. Elena had taken a leave of absence from Defense Weekly, telling her editor that she needed time to work on a book project about her father's military service. It wasn't entirely untrue. though she omitted the fact that her research was uncovering evidence of corruption that reached into the highest levels of the Pentagon and several intelligence agencies. Working from her apartment, Elena had spent countless hours cross-referencing the information on her father's drive with publicly available records, news reports, and military personnel databases. The pattern that emerged was chilling in its scope and sophistication. The corruption her father had discovered wasn't an isolated incident, but part of a systematic operation that had been ongoing for years. Commander Sullivan had maintained contact through encrypted messaging, providing guidance on verification procedures and security protocols while continuing his own parallel investigation. He had access to classified databases and personnel records that Elena couldn't reach through civilian channels, making their collaboration essential to building a comprehensive case. The central figure in the conspiracy was Deputy Defense Secretary Richard Hawthorne, a career government official who had held various positions across multiple administrations. Hawthorne had cultivated relationships with defense contractors and foreign intermediaries that allowed him to profit from weapons sales, intelligence sharing, and military deployment decisions while maintaining plausible deniability about his involvement. Elena's father had discovered evidence linking Hawthorne to the sale of advanced weapons systems to questionable buyers, the deliberate compromise of operational security for financial gain, and the systematic elimination of whistleblowers who threatened to expose the network. The mission where Elena's father and Sullivan had served together hadn't been about eliminating a terrorist leader. It had been about silencing someone who possessed evidence of Hawthorne's activities. The more Elena learned, the more she understood why her father had been murdered. Carlos Rodriguez hadn't just witnessed evidence of corruption. He had recognized the systematic nature of the betrayal and understood its implications for American service members around the world. His questions and investigation had threatened to unravel an operation that generated millions of dollars in illegal profits while putting countless soldiers at risk. Sullivan's investigation had revealed that Elena's father hadn't been the only casualty of Hawthorne's network. Over the past 5 years, at least 7 military personnel who had encountered evidence of the corruption had died in suspicious circumstances. Training accidents, equipment failures, vehicle crashes, all officially explained as tragic but unavoidable incidents, all occurring shortly after the victims had begun asking uncomfortable questions. Elena realized she was walking in her father's footsteps, pursuing the same investigation that had cost him his life. But she also had advantages that he hadn't possessed. As a journalist rather than an active military member, she had more freedom to pursue leads and publish findings. Her collaboration with Sullivan provided access to official channels while maintaining operational security that would protect both of them during the investigation process. The breakthrough came when Elena discovered that one of Hawthorne's financial intermediaries had been careless about electronic security. Banking records showed a pattern of payments that coincided exactly with military operations where American forces had encountered unexpectedly heavy resistance. The timing was too precise to be coincidental. Someone was providing enemy forces with advance warning of American operations in exchange for substantial financial compensation. Elena documented everything meticulously, creating multiple backup copies and establishing secure communication channels with international journalists who could continue the investigation if something happened to her. She had learned from her father's experience that possessing dangerous information alone wasn't enough. The truth needed to be distributed widely enough that eliminating one person wouldn't stop the story from coming to light. Commander Sullivan had been working through official channels to build cases against lower-level participants in the conspiracy, using his security clearance to gather additional evidence while maintaining the appearance of routine administrative review. His position gave him access to personnel files, financial records, and operational reports that provided crucial corroboration for the evidence Elena's father had collected. The investigation had also revealed why Elena's encounter with Sullivan at the naval base hadn't been coincidental. Sullivan had been tracking Hawthorne's network for years, using his legitimate duties to attend events where he might encounter participants or witnesses. Elena's presence as a military correspondent had made her a person of interest, but seeing her father's coordinates tattooed on her arm had confirmed her identity and provided the opportunity he needed to safely transfer the evidence. Elena's apartment had become a war room, with walls covered in photographs, documents, and timeline charts connecting the various participants in Hawthorne's operation. She had installed additional security measures, varied her daily routines, and established check-in protocols with Sullivan to ensure that any attempt to silence her would be immediately detected and responded to. The emotional toll of the investigation was significant. Learning that her father's death had been murder rather than accident had provided closure in some ways, while opening new wounds in others. Elena found herself grieving not just for her father, but for all the service members who had been betrayed by officials they trusted to support their missions and protect their lives. Sullivan had warned her that reaching the publication stage would be the most dangerous phase of their investigation. Once Elena's story was public, Hawthorne and his associates would have nothing to lose by taking extreme measures to discredit or eliminate her. They would have resources and connections that could make her disappear or destroy her credibility before the truth could gain traction in mainstream media. Elena had spent considerable time researching publication strategies that would maximize the story's impact while providing her with protection through public exposure. She had established relationships with editors at multiple major publications, created secure file sharing systems that would automatically release information if she failed to check in regularly, and coordinated with international human rights organizations that could provide additional verification and distribution. The story Elena was preparing to publish would expose not just Hawthorne's network, but the systematic failures and oversight that had allowed such extensive corruption to continue undetected for years. Government agencies that should have been monitoring each other had been compromised by personnel who prioritized personal profit over national security, creating an environment where betrayal could flourish without consequences. Elena's investigation had also revealed the human cost of the corruption beyond the deaths of whistleblowers. American military operations had been compromised, resulting in unnecessary casualties among service members who trusted their leadership to provide accurate intelligence and appropriate support. Weapons and equipment had been diverted to unauthorized buyers, potentially ending up in the hands of enemies who used them against American forces. The complexity of the evidence required careful presentation to ensure that readers could understand the connections between seemingly unrelated events. Elena had worked with data visualization experts to create charts and timelines that would make the financial flows and operational compromises clear to general audiences while maintaining the detailed documentation needed for legal proceedings. Sullivan's parallel investigation had identified potential witnesses who could provide additional testimony about specific incidents, but approaching them safely required careful coordination to avoid alerting Hawthorne's network. Many of the potential witnesses were still serving in sensitive positions where retaliation could end their careers or worse. Elena realized that publishing her investigation would be only the beginning of a longer process of accountability and justice. Congressional hearings, criminal investigations, and military tribunal proceedings could take years to complete, during which time she would need to remain vigilant about her personal security while continuing to develop additional evidence and sources. The weight of responsibility Elena felt was enormous, but it was balanced by her certainty that her father would have wanted her to complete the mission he had started. Carlos Rodriguez had died trying to expose corruption that put American service members at risk, and his daughter was now positioned to ensure that his sacrifice would ultimately serve its intended purpose. Elena's final preparations included establishing international connections that could provide sanctuary if she needed to leave the United States during the publication and investigation phases. She had contacted journalists in countries with strong press freedom protections, ensuring that the story could continue developing even if domestic pressure made her position untenable. The moment of decision was approaching rapidly. Elena had completed her verification process, established her security protocols, and prepared the comprehensive documentation needed to support her allegations. The evidence was overwhelming. The story was ready for publication, and the networks were in place to ensure maximum impact and protection. But Elena also understood that once she took this final step, there would be no going back to her previous life. She would become a public figure, a target for retaliation, and a permanent enemy of powerful people who had already demonstrated their willingness to kill to protect their secrets. The comfortable anonymity of being a routine military correspondent would be replaced by the dangerous visibility of being an investigative journalist who had exposed government corruption at the highest levels. The choice Elena faced was ultimately the same one her father had confronted years earlier, whether to remain silent and safe or speak truth and accept the consequences. Carlos Rodriguez had chosen truth and paid with his life, but his courage had also provided his daughter with the opportunity to complete his mission and achieve the justice he had died pursuing. Elena looked at her father's photograph on her desk, drew a deep breath, and reached for her laptop to begin the final phase of the most important investigation of her career. Her father's tattoo coordinates had brought her to this moment, and she was ready to honor his memory by finishing what he had started, regardless of the personal cost. 6 months after Elena's story broke simultaneously across 3 major news outlets, the reverberations were still being felt throughout Washington and military installations around the world. The coordinated publication strategy had worked exactly as intended, making it impossible for Hawthorne's network to suppress the information before it gained worldwide attention. Deputy Defense Secretary Richard Hawthorne had been arrested within hours of the story's publication, taken into custody by federal marshals as he attempted to board a private flight to a non-extradition country. His personal accounts had been frozen, his security clearance revoked, and his communications monitored as investigators worked to unravel the full extent of his corrupt network. Elena found herself at the center of a media storm unlike anything she had ever experienced. Congressional hearings, television interviews, documentary filmmakers, and book publishers all wanted access to her story and her evidence. She had become the public face of one of the largest military corruption scandals in American history, a role that brought both recognition and danger. The personal cost had been significant. Elena's apartment had been burglarized twice, though nothing valuable was taken, and security experts confirmed the break-ins were professional searches rather than random crimes. She had received anonymous threats through various channels, forcing her to maintain the security protocols that Sullivan had taught her even after the story became public. But the threats had been balanced by support from unexpected sources. Military families whose loved ones had been killed or wounded in the compromised operations reached out to thank Elena for bringing the truth to light. Active duty service members, despite official policies about speaking to media, found ways to express their appreciation for her courage in exposing the betrayal of their trust and sacrifice. Commander Sullivan had testified before multiple congressional committees, providing detailed accounts of the Afghanistan mission where Elena's father had first discovered evidence of Hawthorne's activities. His credibility as a decorated SEAL officer had been crucial in validating Elena's documentation and demonstrating the operational impact of the corruption. The investigation had revealed that Hawthorne's network extended far beyond what Elena's father had originally discovered. Financial analysis showed that the corruption had generated over $50 million in illegal profits, while compromising dozens of military operations across multiple theaters of conflict. The scope of the betrayal had shocked even experienced investigators who thought they understood the potential for institutional corruption. Elena had established the Carlos Rodriguez Foundation for Military Ethics, using speaking fees and book advances to create an organization that supported whistleblowers within the military community and provided resources for investigating potential corruption. The foundation also offered assistance to families of service members who had been killed or wounded in compromised operations. The legal proceedings against Hawthorne and his associates were complex and ongoing. Military tribunals, federal criminal courts, and congressional investigations were all pursuing different aspects of the case simultaneously. Elena had testified repeatedly, each time providing additional context and documentation that strengthened the cases against various participants in the network. Sullivan had been promoted to a position within naval intelligence where he could help establish new oversight procedures designed to prevent similar corruption in the future. His experience investigating Hawthorne's network had made him an expert on identifying and disrupting illegal activities within military and intelligence communities, skills that were desperately needed as the institutions worked to rebuild public trust. Elena's career had evolved beyond traditional journalism into something more like advocacy and investigation. Major news organizations competed for her attention when other potential corruption cases emerged, and she had become a trusted source for service members who discovered evidence of wrongdoing within their chains of command. The impact on military culture had been profound and positive. New whistleblower protection protocols had been established, financial oversight procedures had been strengthened, and accountability mechanisms had been put in place to ensure that future corruption would be detected and addressed before it could compromise operations or cost lives. Elena often reflected on the series of seemingly random events that had led to this outcome. Her decision to attend the sealed demonstration, her choice to wear a jacket that she later removed in the warming sun, the specific coordinates her father had given her for a tattoo, Sullivan's recognition of those numbers. Any one of these factors being different would have prevented the truth from coming to light. But Elena had come to understand that her father's final mission hadn't depended on coincidence alone. Carlos Rodriguez had carefully planned for the possibility that he might not survive to complete his investigation personally. The coordinates he had given Elena weren't random. They were a signal, a way to identify her to someone like Sullivan who would recognize their significance and understand that she could be trusted with dangerous information. The healing process had been gradual, but meaningful. Elena's relationship with her father's memory had evolved from grief over his loss to pride in his courage and appreciation for the sacrifice he had made to protect other service members. Understanding the true circumstances of his death had brought closure that years of unanswered questions had prevented. Elena had also developed an unexpected relationship with Sullivan that went beyond their professional collaboration. Their shared experience of investigating her father's death had created a bond based on mutual respect and common purpose. Sullivan understood the weight of carrying dangerous information, and Elena appreciated his dedication to honoring her father's memory through their joint pursuit of justice. The foundation Elena had established was growing rapidly, attracting support from across the military community and beyond. Donations came from active duty personnel, veterans, military families, and civilians who understood the importance of maintaining ethical standards within institutions responsible for national security. The foundation had already assisted several whistleblowers and identified multiple cases of potential corruption that were under investigation. Elena's speaking engagements had taken her to military bases, congressional hearings, university campuses, and international conferences on government accountability. She had become an advocate not just for military ethics, but for the broader principle that truth and justice were worth pursuing regardless of personal cost or institutional resistance. The documentary film about Elena's investigation had won several awards and brought international attention to the importance of protecting whistleblowers within military and intelligence communities. The film had been particularly effective in demonstrating how corruption at high levels could have deadly consequences for service members who trusted their leadership to provide accurate intelligence and appropriate support. Elena's book about her father's story and their joint investigation had become a bestseller, providing her with financial independence that allowed her to be more selective about her journalism work and focus on cases where she could make a meaningful difference. The book had also generated substantial donations to her foundation and inspired other journalists to pursue similar investigations. The long-term impact of Elena's investigation was still developing, but early indicators suggested that significant reforms were taking root within military and defense institutions. New oversight procedures, strengthened accountability mechanisms, and enhanced protection for whistleblowers were making it more difficult for corruption to flourish undetected. Elena had received numerous journalism awards for her investigation, including recognition from international press freedom organizations that understood the risks she had accepted in pursuing the story. But the recognition that meant the most to her came from military families who expressed gratitude that their loved ones' deaths had finally been properly investigated and that their sacrifices had contributed to meaningful reform. The threat level Elena faced had decreased significantly as Hawthorne and his key associates were convicted and imprisoned, but she maintained security protocols as a precaution against retaliation from other participants in the network who might still be at large. Her visibility as a public figure provided some protection, but it also made her a potential target for anyone who wanted to discourage similar investigations in the future. Elena's apartment walls were no longer covered with investigation materials, but They did display her father's military decorations alongside photographs from his service and the letter of commendation he had received for the mission where he first encountered evidence of corruption. She had also framed the final message he had left for her, written shortly before his death, expressing his pride in her work as a journalist and his hope that she would continue asking difficult questions even when they led to uncomfortable answers. The coordinates tattooed on Elena's arm had taken on new meaning as the investigation progressed and concluded. What had begun as a way to honor her father's service had become a symbol of his final mission and her commitment to completing it. The compass rose, and numbers that had caught Sullivan's attention at the naval base demonstration had ultimately led to justice for her father and protection for countless future service members. Elena often wondered what her father would think of the outcome of their joint investigation. She believed he would be proud that his death had ultimately served a purpose greater than protecting corrupt officials, that his sacrifice had led to reforms that would protect other service members from similar betrayal. The truth he had died defending had finally been exposed, and the people responsible for his death were facing consequences for their actions. The relationship Elena had developed with Sullivan had evolved into something beyond professional collaboration or shared mission. Their mutual respect and understanding had grown into genuine affection, built on a foundation of common values and shared experience that few people could comprehend. They had both paid personal costs for their pursuit of justice, and they had both found meaning in honoring her father's memory through their continued work together. Elena's life had been permanently changed by the events that began with her attendance at a routine military demonstration, but she had no regrets about the path she had chosen. Her father's courage in pursuing dangerous truth had inspired her own commitment to justice and accountability, even when the personal costs were high. The tattoo that had started everything served as a daily reminder that truth and honor were worth defending, regardless of the opposition they might encounter. As Elena looked toward the future, she saw opportunities to continue building on the foundation her investigation had established. Military ethics reform, government accountability advocacy, and protection for whistleblowers were ongoing challenges that required sustained attention and commitment. Her father's final mission would continue through her work and the work of others who understood that democracy and military effectiveness depended on institutional integrity that could withstand scrutiny and challenge. The sound that had died when Sullivan first saw Elena's tattoo had been replaced by the voices of justice, accountability, and reform that would echo through military institutions for generations to come. Carlos Rodriguez's death had meaning, his daughter's courage had purpose, and their joint legacy would protect countless future service members from the betrayal and corruption that had once threatened to undermine the very institutions they served to defend.